Do It All Dad here. Today we're going to be replacing the inner and the outer tie rods on this 2006 Chrysler PT Cruiser using the Mayhew Universal Speedy inner tie rod tool. It makes replacing the inner portion of the tie rods a breeze, even if you have the OEM types that are rounded, don't have the flat faces. You might not see this in a lot of other videos, but it can be very difficult to get these out without a tool like this. Let's get started. Now the way that this tool works is there are 3 cams that clamp down onto the face of the tie rod. So it doesn't matter if you've got those flat surfaces to get your wrench on or not. This one in fact is square. This is the replacement rod, not a hex. Some of the tools that you might be able to rent from places like Advanced Auto Parts could work on installing this one, but a lot of the OEM types are completely rounded. They will not have that flat surface to facilitate removal. So really one of the only ways to get it out is using a tool like this or something similar that doesn't require a flat surface. The other thing that we are going to be doing is making sure that our replacement tie rod, outer tie rod end, does not have the grease valve on it. Some of these will come with a grease valve that you will need to install and fill up with grease after you've done the installation. If you don't happen to have a grease gun to do that kind of an installation, just find ones that already come with the boot fully greased on the inside. Okay, so one of the other things that we're going to need to have available to use this tool, because it does not have a square drive for accepting a socket on the end of it, only a hex outside, will be some larger size sockets, and it will use a 30mm socket or a 1 3/16 socket. Either of those will work to utilize the tool. Alright, once we've got the tension spring off of the inner boot, make sure that that guy is nice and loose around the inner tie rod end. Before we take the outer end off, we're going to crack that jam nut. Alright, got our jam nut loose, back it off a little bit. Take a look at our outer tie rod end here. As you can see, the boot is pretty destroyed and there's play in these ends, so we've got to replace both the inner and the outer. Alright, so this bottom nut takes an 18mm. We broke it loose already. This happens to be a lock nut, not a castle nut. Now, to get the outer end free from the knuckle, there's a couple different ways we can do this. One is a pickle fork, which, if you don't mind destroying the boot around your end, you can do that. Otherwise, you can use the hammering technique. Now, the tricky part to this is going to be ensuring that the shroud around the outer end is not damaged. There we go. Now she's popped off. Alright, now that we've got the outer end loose, you can see the play in and out, as well as our now damaged end from using the pickle fork, but this also has too much play in it. We're removing and replacing both. Alright, so now our next step is going to be getting the ring on the inner boot off. As we can see, there's that little tab there sticking out. So we're going to get a screwdriver in there, pry it open, and then we'll use the snips to cut it off. Alright, so the boot strap was a little bit too thick for the snips to get at it with that kind of leverage, so we just pried it off, and as you can see, those little tabs there fit into these little tabs here, and once you get it off of that, it'll come loose and right off. The next thing we're going to want to do is remove that boot off of the inner tie rod end. Sometimes the outer edge of this boot, there's an insert on the tie rod where this boot will sit, and these can sometimes get seized up. So one trick is to get some penetrating oil, squirt that in there, You can also get a screwdriver in there. Again, being careful not to destroy or damage the boot. We want to reuse that. Generally, the parts kits for inner and outer tie rod ends are not going to give you the boot or the clamps, so we want to be careful with that. And one trick to getting that boot up and out of that little insert is to get your screwdriver in there, get part of it out, and then work the boot down. Alright, so now that we got the boot off, want to check to make sure it doesn't have any tears or holes in it where we'd have to replace it. Certainly don't want to put an inner tie rod end with a damaged boot back on it. It's just asking for failure down the road. And as we can see, this inner end here is really pretty bad. Looks like there's some dust buildup. So we want to be very careful about checking the boot here to make sure that there aren't any gaps in it. All right, another thing that you're going to want to be careful for, the vent here on the boot. This allows air to move back and forth between the two ends so that when the bellows compress, the air goes from one side to the other side without it forcing the air in and out of the steering system. So we want to be careful that we get that lined back up, and as you can see, there's a little bit of a clamp on the end there, so you want to be careful to take that clamp off to facilitate removal of the boot. All right, now the fun part. So before we put our inner tie rod tool on the inner tie rod itself, let's clean it up. We don't want to get a messy tool that we got to later clean, especially since this particular tool has some intricate workings that we don't want to get gummed up with debris and grease. And all this does is that it slides right over the outer or the inner tie rod, seats around it, and through a cam action, as you twist it, will tighten. That's it. Off she will come. And there we go. And one of the other things about what they call an OEM-type inner tie rod, you can see that it's completely rounded. There is no spot to get any kind of a wrench on it. So even that tool that you can get from Advanced Auto Parts or your local store will not sit on there. There's no real good way to grasp it. This tool does it instantaneously. Works for extracting them as well as installation. We'll show that next. Alright, so our replacement tie rod here does have the flat surfaces that conventional tie rod, inner tie rod tools will accommodate, but using the Speedy inner tie rod tool, we don't even need to worry about that. This will work on any size tie rod that we need. Now, before we do the installation, we're going to apply some blue removable type thread locker to the threads to ensure that our tie rod does not back out when we're doing any kind of adjustments to the toe angle. And then we're also going to be replacing this bumper, which sits just like that on the inside of the inner tie rod. Now, this came off of the existing tie rod end. There were no shims that came with this replacement. However, this plastic component here does appear to be a bumper that prevents the tie rod from going too far in as the wheel is turned. That could cause problems, so we'll be replacing that. So once we've got it snug, we'll back our jam nut off of the inner tie rod end. Alright, so once we have the tie rod fully inserted. We're going to tighten it up with the tool. All we need to do is just slide it on all the way so that those 3 cams grab onto the outside. Twist it until it grabs, and then tighten. Now you don't want to over tighten it, potentially causing damage to the rack and pinion. And if you have access to the specs on the torque setting, you can use a torque wrench as well. Alright, so next we're going to put the boot back on to the inner tie rod. Before we do so, we're going to attach, not tight, our stainless steel zip tie so that we don't have to fish around for it. Once the boot's already set, we can just cinch it down after the boot is already installed. We're also going to put our breather tube retaining clip onto that breather tube before we slip the boot on, so that way after the boot is on, we just move the retaining clip back around and seat it around the breather tube after it's seated correctly. Get it seated around there nicely. We'll use our pliers. Get that around the breather tube. Now we're going to grab our end of the clamp with one pliers. Use a screwdriver to hold the edge of the band clamp in place, and then pull tight. The next step is going to be to make sure that the outside of the boot sits in this little ring right here, this little indent. You can feel it kind of sit into that spot. Then we'll slide our snap ring around it, let it tighten. So before we install the outer end, one of the things that we're going to want to make sure, and you don't see this in a lot of other videos, but it can be a problem solver if you're having issues with the castle nut not tightening down all the way and seating the outer end into the knuckle properly. What we're going to do is we're going to clean out the inside of that channel here, make sure there's no grease or other lubricants that could cause the ball joint here to spin. Add our jam nut. Send it down pretty much as far as it's going to go. Now, one of the keys to making sure that your alignment can be adjusted in the future when necessary is to thread this portion and the inside of the outer end so that the two can rotate freely. We don't want them seizing up. We especially don't want water getting in there, because if it's difficult to spin the tie rod in place that will move the outer end back and forth to adjust the toe, we're going to have problems. We could even back out the inner tie rod end from the rack itself. We don't want that. Now, I'm not counting the number of turns, because I have found that that is not a good way to get even an approximate toe correctly aligned. And I'll show you a better way to do it than the number of turns method. So we bottom this outer end all the way out, back it out one, Now we'll maneuver this in place and bring it down. Adjust the angle. That's nice and stiff. We want a nice, stiff, tight steering. We're going to reinstall the shroud before it goes in. Next, we'll start our castle nut on there, and we'll tighten it down. Now, one of the tricky things is making sure that you get the correct torque on that castle nut while still allowing enough room for the cotter pin to go in. Now, one of the other things that I did while I was also doing the inner and the outer tie rods was I replaced the lower control arms. These bushings had completely deteriorated. While the ball joint underneath here was good, the bushings and the suspension was bad. We also went ahead, it's about a 100,000 mile vehicle, we replaced the complete strut assembly, strut spring, strut bearing, and the bumper as well. And on the 2006 PT Cruiser, this is probably true for the other PT Cruiser models as well, in order to get the lower control arm off, there's a bolt that sits behind the lower motor mount. These tend to go bad. There's plenty of other videos out there that talk about how to remove this. It's pretty straightforward. But in order to remove the lower control arm here, you do have to remove this lower motor mount. So we did that because we wanted to make sure that we don't have to spend more than our hard-earned dollars on more than one alignment, and we went ahead and did things that while we had the opportunity and doing a bunch of work with the car up and out of service for a while, is replace other components of the suspension. Alright, so our last step is going to be getting our alignment approximately back to a point where the car is drivable and we can take it to a shop to get a correct computerized alignment. And if you did the spin method to put the tie rods back on, you're going to get close, but I've found in my experience that even using that method, the toe alignment is still probably going to be fairly off, and you're going to need to do some additional adjustments before the car really is even going to be drivable. So one of the ways that we can do that is using some clamps, a tape measure, and some straight pieces of material. In this case, I've got some plywood, and we'll be clamping them onto the rotors, sticking them out from the front, and measuring the distance between the two and the directions that they point. Alright, so the first thing we're going to want to do is get our steering wheel back to straight. Okay, so making sure that our jam nut is backed off of the outer end so that we can adjust it. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to clamp this piece of material on the outer edge of our rotor. And you got to be careful because some of the rotors are not attached directly to the hub. If the caliper is in place, it should be pretty close. As you can see, this is going to affect our toe approximation somewhat. Make sure that it's against the knuckle here so that we can get correct measurements. And what we'll do is we'll keep the piece of material sticking as far as we can go straight out the front so that we can measure the ends and the differences between those two, how close or far apart they are. Alright, so the first step, what we can do is we can look down the length of the vehicle. We can see approximately what line from the rear wheel the front wheel should be straight. It's hard to tell from this camera angle, but that piece of material, the plywood, is out, toe out, so we'll have to adjust that to bring the toe in. On the passenger side, we can do the same thing. Looking down the length of the vehicle, this also looks toe out, so we're going to have to bring both sides of the toe in, and we'll keep eyeballing it until we're pretty close. Then we'll get our tape measure out and compare two different locations on the wood material to see how accurate we are. Okay, now on the passenger side we've got some toe out, and what we want to do is rotate the tie rod out so that it backs out of the outer tie rod and separates it, pushing the toe back in. What you can do is keep an eye on that clamped piece of material and see how far it's moving. You can get fairly close just by looking at it, eyeballing it. Okay, so we're on the driver's side now, and we're going to repeat the same procedure. We're going to, because we have toe out, we want to bring the toe back in. We have to force the tie rod out this way, so we're going to back the inner rod out of the outer rod and force those two apart. All right, now that we've got our alignment eyeballed approximately, we'll go to the next step here. We'll get it as close as we can get it. We'll use our tape measure, and then we'll measure as close as we can to the rotor here, and then we'll also take a measurement out here at the outer edge between our two pieces of material, that point to this point, and we'll want to get the distances between those two as close as we can get from here to here. That way, with respect to each of the two wheels, they'll be true with on their toe. And it doesn't really matter which point you use as long as you're consistent. So I'm going to measure to the outer edge here of the material, since on the other side, the end of the tape measure is sitting on the outside. 59 and 5/8. Now we'll bring it to the outer edge, being careful not to pull, depends on how rigid your material is, but we want to be careful not to pull the material closer to one another, because we want to measure as close as we can the distance. So we're pretty close here, about 59, that's 3/4. So we're pretty close. That should be good enough to take the vehicle now, get a proper alignment done. Our inner and outer tie rod ends are done. And finally, after we've had an opportunity to take our vehicle in to get a computerized alignment, we can see how well we did on our approximate toe alignment. From the left toe to the right toe, we had a total of 0.35 degrees off, actually within specification, so that's great for being able to make sure that the vehicle is drivable before we put it back onto the road and take it to a shop to get the computerized alignment done. The steer ahead was considerably off. That's fine. That's when the wheel will be slightly crooked, even though the vehicle will be traveling down the road straight. That can be corrected during the alignment process with the proper tooling. And this is what it looks like after the alignment had been corrected. As we can see, the left and the right toe are now in specification. The total toe has been corrected just a little bit better than what we were able to achieve, down to 0.15 degrees. And then, of course, the steer ahead was corrected to be within specification as well. And that's it.